I will hit the record button. And I'll start this off with some conversation about good governance. And good governance in my cake, you can tell I'm hungry. It is supper time. We have a good foundation of our cake. That is the Societies Act, your bylaws, the legislation, in this case, PIPA legislation, all of those foundational crusty pieces. On top of that, we have good process around policies and procedures, things that you do like board orientation and board renewal that keeps a board in good process and healthy. On top of that is good decision making, which is just what governance is. Governance is a fancy word for decision making. And good governance just means good decision making. Right? Decisions that you look back on and say that was the right decision at that right time. And then up top, we have good strategy, because boards are about what we call hindsight, which is looking at the reporting, the oversight, which is the day-to-day operations, and then the foresight, which is the strategy piece, looking ahead to position yourself. Record management is in the good foundation piece. Record management is one of those foundational pieces, because without it, the rest of this becomes a very shaky cake. And we have all been there. We all have seen, policies that nobody knows about, that are in a binder somewhere or a folder. We've seen people leaving the board and taking all the passwords with them. We've seen people, we've been in meetings where you know that the board has discussed this. You distinctly remember having this discussion, but you can't find it in the minutes. You can't find the minutes. No one has a document you need, right? Somebody has it, but it's on their phone, or the other person can't open it, so on and so forth. We've all been in those very frustrating meetings. Or you're looking for an approved version of something, and all you can find are the drafts. And those are the kind of record management stuff that gets in the way of good decision making. So with that, I will turn it over to Donna, who will talk to you about that good record management. And we are intending to keep you until 8 o'clock. If you have to go early, our hearts will not be broken. They might be bruised a little bit, but not broken. And if you have any specific questions that are detailed in nature, you can always stay on the call rather than having everybody hear about it. So with that, Donna, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. So we had a question earlier from Chantel about PIPA, which is the Personal Information Protection Act, and we'll be covering that in tonight's workshop as well. As we worked on this workshop, we put together elements of the privacy legislation that really impacts community leagues here in Edmonton, as well as the records management, because in my view, they go hand in hand. And I think the greatest success many organizations are having right now is that when they're recognizing how to manage information as a whole, thinking about privacy, thinking about records management together. So when Sandra and I put this workshop together for your information, Chantel, that's what we were thinking. And it worked really well to put the two topics together tonight in one workshop. So on the screen, you see the file folder where you would be, putting your personal receipts for taxes, receipts, the personal items you might buy. So all of us have a system. Some people do a much better job of it than others. You can see that this is a paper-based system where you would have probably an accordion file and you're slipping your receipts as you purchase something into here. We have historically done record keeping throughout our entire lives. Some people better than others. But what tonight is about is really talking about it as a group on your board so that you're excelling and sort of helping your organization do better than where you may be at. So I hope you can take some tips and tricks away from tonight's session that will help you to be more successful in the work that you're doing to manage information. Next slide, Sandra.
Next slide, Sandra.
Okay, so this was mentioned earlier from Sandra. So if you have a burning question where you really came to join the call tonight for the purpose of having some particular question answered, we'd love to know about it, because I certainly want to make sure that from the outset, I'm customizing this to some question you may have. So if you're from a particular community league and there's something you really want answered, you know, I know that Sandra and I both feel strongly that we'd like to know from the beginning if you have a kind of question that way, because we'll kind of steer this session to make sure it's valuable for you. I realize you're giving up your evening as a volunteer, and I respect that. And I want to make sure that we're making this an incredible learning opportunity for you. So if there's something you really want to know, just post it in the chat, and we'll definitely kind of be making sure we try to address it. And if it's something we're going to answer at the end, we'll let you know that too. Next slide, Sandra. Okay, so one thing that's important to know about as we're working on this, or as we're delivering this content to you, I wanted to share with you an important part about what is a record, which is fundamental for understanding. So this particular definition is pulled from the PIPA Act, which is not the main governance document that community leagues fall under, which is the Personal Information Protection Act. But both acts use fairly the same definition. And the point that I want to emphasize is a record means a record of information in any form and includes notes, images, audiovisual recordings, x-rays, books, documents, maps, drawings, photographs, letters, voucher and papers, and any other information that is written, photographed, recorded, or stored in any manner. But it does not include the software or any mechanism that produces records. So for many leagues, they might be using Google. The actual Google software is not part of the record, but the Excel spreadsheet is. The printed out version of a spreadsheet might be the true record of an organization. What the important part of this is in the next slide, Sandra, if you can bring that up. We want you to actually think about what the record is for your organization. So for this situation, you can see a laptop, you can see a phone, and you can see a paper date book. So in the work that we do, we're actually using records in all formats, and some organizations better than others. Many organizations are struggling with what's been termed content sprawl, where some content is kept in multiple repositories and nobody's really sure what the true record is. So it's becoming more difficult for people to actually manage their information. And when we had the earlier picture of the boardroom with no one sitting at the table, the pandemic has really challenged us. Many people are working remotely, and that means that we need to make sure that we actually are keeping records that are going to satisfy the needs of our organization. Now, Sandra, there was an earlier question about whether we're making this presentation available. And I know that that's part of the housekeeping that
Yep.
we will be sending that out. Do you want to just quickly speak to that right now?
Yep, so I answered that in the chat. And for those of you who are interested, we will be sending out the slides. And there's some other resources that Dawn is going to mention that will come out to you as well.
Great, thanks, Sandra. So next slide. Okay, personal information. Now, this is a very important part of the work that you're doing. And I know we had a membership director that posted into the chat. The membership folks and program staff often really do collect quite a bit of personal information. So personal information is information that can be used to identify a particular person. For example, a name, address, phone number, and information about that individual. So it could also include their physical description and their educational background. So for much of the work that we do in community leagues, we often are collecting membership information. It could be membership information on an entire family where we're collecting ages, interests, hobbies, you know, quite a lot of content. So we need to be concerned that we're making sure that that information is protected. And I want you to have this definition as part of our workshop tonight so that we all start from the same position. Next slide. Okay, so in Alberta, we primarily need to be concerned about these three pieces of legislation, which is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And it's always referenced as FOIP. So FOIP, just one P. And so it is actually a piece of legislation where most government organizations fall under, which includes the city of Edmonton. So for all of us that might be getting project funding, you need to make sure you're looking at the contracts you're getting and making sure that if there's any FOIP requirement that they're placing on you, you're following that privacy legislation in terms of that FOIP adherence that you might have to do for your organization. The other thing that we need to be concerned about is the Health Information Act, which is also known as HIA. And that is an act where we are governed in Alberta for protecting health information for individuals. Finally, the third piece of legislation is the Personal Information Protection Act, which is known as PIPA. And that's the one I mentioned earlier. And it's a piece of legislation that's in place that it governs the collection and privacy related to personal information. Next slide, please, Sandra. Okay, so I have this slide in the package and this will be coming to you. So it applies to private sector organizations, such as businesses, employees, partnerships, trade unions, and professional regulatory bodies. It controls the way a private sector organization may collect, use, or disclose personal information and personal employee information. You must get consent to collect, use, or disclose an individual's personal information. A collection without consent is authorized in some situations under PIPA, but you'd have to look at the legislation to make sure you're understanding when that is. Consent is not required for the collection, use, or disclosure of personal employee information by the employer that is reasonably required for the work relationship. So I'll give you an example. If you've hired a rink attendant and they're working for you as an employee and you need to disclose that information for WCB, you are authorized to do that without asking their consent. So it's obviously a situation where you have an employee relationship with someone and you are allowed to disclose that information for the purposes of that employee relationship. Now, a privacy breach occurs if personal information is lost, accessed, or disclosed improperly, and there is a risk of significant harm. So if you have one of your volunteers that has the entire membership list on a memory stick, and then they lose that memory stick, if it has people's home phone numbers, addresses, and a lot of their personal information about their ages and interests and hobbies. Maybe it even has information on financial aspects to them. Then you need to be concerned about the privacy breach that may have occurred and assess that situation. Next slide. So this is a screen or a diagram of the records management life cycle. And we're going to be covering this in tonight's workshop, where as organizations, we create information, we use and classify it, we retain it, we appraise it to identify its value, and then finally we make a decision about what we're going to keep and what we're going to destroy. And that's what the term disposition means. In the world that we're working in now, there's a lot of information that we have that is both paper and electronic. Paper records should be securely shredded, while an electronic record might be expunged from a system so that it is permanently destroyed without having an ability to be recreated again. Next slide, Sandra. Collecting information. So this is the very first image on that diagram that we just looked at. So what do you collect and when? So these are some examples that a community league would often collect information as they're working to do the activities of the organization. They'll often get people's name, address, phone number, and an email address, their birth date and their age. Sometimes we'll be collecting credit card information. For board members, we might be gathering a criminal background check. We might also be getting a vulnerable sector check, depending on the nature of their role. We ultimately often gather the social insurance number for many of the employees that we would be bringing up to our organization. We would have a driving record for some staff. We have contact information for a parent or spouse to be used in an emergency. We might be collecting a provincial health care number for a particular program. as well as medical information that we might need, such as whether they have some allergies or something that we need to know about in terms of being allergic to bee stings or etc. And sometimes we might be collecting a driver's license number. Next slide, Sandra. So one of the first things you need to think about as you're doing that is, do you need the information? So one of the ways that the world has really changed with privacy protection is that people will ask questions similar to this one. Do you actually need that information? So you should be clear as a league, your purposes for collecting the personal information. Are you doing it to maintain a membership list so that you can administer membership benefits to your league's members? Are you actually doing it so you can mail out a newsletter? It might be physically mailing it through Canada Post, or it could also be an email list where you're keeping an email address list. Are you keeping that information to register a participant? Is it needed for processing a payment for a product or service? Is it so that you can actually create a receipt for a payment or a donation? Is it because you're running a program and you need to be able to contact a family member in case that there's an emergency? Or are you actually collecting it to ensure the health and safety of the participants in a program, such as medical information, such as allergies for the children that might be attending a camp program? Any questions on that from anybody? Does that look straightforward? So it's easy to see that you will be collecting personal information. So it's important to know in your mind as you're doing it, do you actually need that information? Dave, you have a question. Did you just want to come off mute and raise it?
Sure, just a short one. In the collection of this information, is there a sort of end of life for it? Is there a period of its useful life and then you can dispose of it?
Yeah, that's why there's a link to records management. Excellent question, Dave. Some people in many organizations don't have an answer to that question. But what Sandra and I believe is that we really need to have that answer so that when we're gathering it, if someone just should say to you, well, how long are you going to keep this for? That you would actually have an answer. So that is a secondary question. You're right on track in our mind too of what you should be doing. Like first is collecting, and then second, well, how long are we keeping it? Did you have a follow-up question?
I learned that from the U of A. They keep it for 5 years and then it's disposed of. And of course, they have a lot of great detailed information. So they've committed to just 5 years of keeping it.
Right. So that's another aspect. I do a lot of retention schedule work, and there's a common perception that everything is kept for 7 years because of Canada Revenue Agency and financial information. I just wish the world was that black and white, because it would really make my job easier, but it's not. So the thing to do is to assess what it needs to be kept and for how long and why you have it. And there's sort of, sadly, the answer is often, it depends. And you need to do the analysis for what you need it for. And we'll be touching on that a little bit later in this workshop. Sandra will make sure I'm prompted to answer that question in a better way. Next slide. Okay, so consent is important under PIPA, the Personal Information Protection Act. Organizations need to consent, need consent from the people that are collecting information to collect, use, and disclose that personal information about clients unless the Act says otherwise. And when obtaining consent, you must notify your clients of the information you collect and how you will use it. You must also give your clients the name and contact information of your privacy contact person in case they have questions. So this notice can be included on a membership application form, whether that's be online or even some kind of hard copy card, or a registration form, or it also can be given orally. Now, as Sandra and I put this workshop together, she had this great question of, well, does that have to be the same person on every single form and document you have in your organization? And the answer is no. You know, as it might be the program person is a contact for certain documents that you're getting consent from. It could be that the membership director is a certain contact point. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the exact same person that's used as the point of contact on every single collection form and document that you're using to gather that consent from. You know, as your organization has different directors and different roles, there might be different people that are actually named in this particular collection statement. Now, your organization may at times collect information for one purpose and want to use it for another later on, but if so, you must really obtain the consent for that other purpose. So you can't just sort of do one thing and then use the information for another purpose that other than what it was initially intended for, without really thinking about what you're doing. Next slide. So here are some examples of some consent statements, and there's more examples and more information in the resources that Sandra's going to be sending out. But this is a couple of examples just to show you what we're talking about so that you can read what we're suggesting be in documents that you might be putting out as you're gathering information. So if you're actually in the process of maintaining a membership list for the purposes of providing a member benefit, you might have a statement that says, we require the above information to ensure that our membership list is current and to send you information about our programs and services, as well as renewal notices. So to me, it's a very simply worded statement. It's easy to read and understand, and I hope that the person reading that would understand what the purpose of the requested consent is for. The second one is to have a situation where you want to register participants for a training program. So we require the above information for registration and administration of this training session. Information may be used for program evaluation. So you can see in that second example, while it's for also the registration and administration, they have in the second sentence that they're identifying that it could also be used for another purpose. So they're being very upfront about how there might be another purpose that they might use that information for. So they just have the one statement provided at the outset. Next slide, Sandra. Keeping information. Now, this is going to Dave's question. You know, how long are we going to actually keep this once we have it? Next slide, Sandra. So in setting up a records management system, many organizations are going with a functional approach. And what that means is rather than doing a subject-based analysis of your record keeping, they often will do it by the function being served by the records. Now, typically in community leagues, this list is often the common functions that are performed. And I know that many of you will often see in looking at this list, how certain directors might be heavily involved in particular aspects. Like the financial management one would be a significant area of interest to the treasurer. Facilities management might be a significant area of interest for the executive, as well as if there is somebody that's in charge of facilities. Communications and marketing might be of huge interest to a communications and marketing director. So you see in this listing that how the suggestion is to set things up by function, and why organizations do that is it's more stable than a lot of other systems for record keeping. It seems to work very well, and it's set up this way because it follows international standards, which really focus on doing record keeping by function. Next slide. So source of truth. I wanted to highlight this, and I mentioned earlier that organizations are struggling with record keeping in multiple repositories. Paper, there's often things on laptops, there's things in systems like using Google or whatever software you might be using by your board. And as a result, we have records in multiple repositories, particularly over time. In much of this work, people are struggling to identify what the source of truth is. And what that concept means is, in your organization, do you have an endorsed repository for your records? So as of 2022, right now in June, could you name where the minutes should be stored? Can you identify where emails are to be retained? Can you identify what should be done to manage the information you're accountable for? What is your treasurer doing, and how is he or she storing the records? What is the endorsed repository for the information that you're required to keep? Next slide. So where do you begin? Well, I think one of the most important things to do is to have a plan. So identifying some kind of file structure that will work for your organization, figuring out how you're going to name the files that you have, and doing that as a board. So developing a system for what makes sense for your group. So is that by having it by date, which often the international standard is year, month, date. Often the next thing is having a meaningful description that makes sense to the whole board. And then identifying frequently what's a draft, what's signed, what's final, approved, and also if there's an audited version. And that's a huge time saver for organizations when they're able to do that. It's important to decide as a group how to manage your records and then have everyone agree to use the system that you've made and put into place. So it's also part of an orientation as a board so that the group knows this is how we're going to manage our records as a group. Any questions about that? Does anybody have in place a system like this where they're actually doing it to having a naming convention and having a system where they've set up? Can you share that with us if anybody's had any experience doing it this way?
Not in my group, no. I've wanted to impose one, but I can't get agreement on how to approach it. I've done it professionally for many decades, but I can't seem to get everyone to agree on what would work best for.
Okay, that's an interesting statement, Dave. So the challenge of that is to get everybody to see the value of it, correct? So I guess on that point,
Yeah.
anybody that's ever struggled to find something and taken unbelievable amounts of time and then had to redo it all because they can't locate it, that's a reason to set up a file naming convention and to organize things into a system that makes sense. I guess the other thing, Sandra, the operating grant is a big one coming up, right? Where now there's certain requirements for accountability, and that will be an opportunity too. Can you speak a little bit about that?
The portion where these need to report on their what their priorities are for the next year. Yeah, I mean, the operating grant has changed with the new tripartite agreement as to what leagues need to report, which will cause you to be needing to keep a little more information about which, because now there's the what I call the hindsight reporting, that what we did last year, but also the foresight reporting. What are we going to do for the next year, right? But I've had, we had a case where a community league was struck from the society's register. They had to revitalize their registration because they hadn't filed for 3 years. And what was holding them up was trying to find a copy of a past audited financial statement. Right? And finally, a past president was called and was able to do it. So yeah, I mean, it's the oddest thing here because everybody has been frustrated by not being able to find things, but people are hesitant to put the time in to create a filing system. So it seems that both exist at the same time. And Lisa had a question, and then I think Teresa.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there any issue with the city, et cetera, to keep it all electronically? Like, do we need to make hard copies?
No,
that's a great question. So
yeah,
go ahead, Sandra.
there doesn't seem to be. In fact, if you try to submit something through registries in person, in paper, they're not even open to accept that paper. They'll send you away, tell you to do it online. So there doesn't seem to be any of those types of issues.
Right. So there is in legislation, the Electronic Transaction Act, which really does allow for electronic record keeping to support the transition that we need to make as a society. So there is really nothing in place that's a barrier.
No. Lisa had her hand up.
That was me. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Darlene?
It's to do with the hi. It's a question to do with the not having to have paper copies And with CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, when we had a review, they wanted all paper copies. So that's different, like, because it's the Canada Revenue, or have they changed their rulings? I mean, that's a little bit off base of what you're talking about here, but.
What did they want to see? Can you tell us more?
They did an audit. So because the building McKernan, we ended up paying out like, 50,000 plus in GST in the build. And so then we got a GST rebate, and CRA doesn't really like to give money. They prefer to take money. So in that process, they decided we needed to be audited, which is fine. But in the audit process, it was invoices, for builders. It was contracts. It was everything that they insisted on a paper copy of, which I could have printed off if we only had an electronic record. But that kind of left me feeling as though I should be hanging on to paper copies some. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of organization over the pandemic that really moved to electronic record keeping and scanning and digitization, just because it was impossible to work with one area that had a paper copy and everybody's working remotely from home.
Right.
So in this day and age, there's really an effort now to have, systems like QuickBooks or Excel or some kind of system for managing information, especially things like invoices. Often they are scanned and saved, so that there's a better sharing of information from having a hard copy that really cannot be shared very well at all. I'm kind of surprised to hear CRA suggesting that. But I have worked myself personally with bookkeepers and accountants, and many of them are just going completely electronic. So that's very interesting.
Well, and it was pre-pandemic, by the way. It was 2019. So that's the interesting part of what you just said. Thank you, because that's probably shifted. But because I was surprised that they insisted on paper. But anyways, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of webinars that have occurred in the last 2 years, and they believe that we've made a 20-year jump in record keeping formats, and the way that we've been slowly moving to electronic really boomed over the pandemic. Well, you can see that we're on a screen right now. So, you realize the difference that we are at in this day and age.
Thanks, Donna.
Catherine has a question.
Unmute. Yeah, I was going to ask Donna what you would suggest. You started saying, do we know where the minutes are and that sort of thing. So I'm not thinking of the contractors or the, other financial things, but, and as somebody who would probably prefer to read something in a paper copy and can find paper better than I can find electronic things sometimes, do you have a suggestion, or will you get to that in terms of like, where should the minutes be, and so on?
Sandra, do we want to kind of hold that question maybe? What do you think?
Yeah, we
let's hold
we
that.
do have a bit of a, well, not so much on the minutes. I mean, minutes can follow this same structure that we're talking about on the slide, right? So do minutes need to be in paper? No, they don't. I mean, if you feel better in paper, you always can print them off and have your own copy, but then we'll need to talk about what happens when you're no longer on the board.
So minutes are.
Can I just, I'm not on the board, but if I wanted to read the minutes, where are you suggesting that they be? Like, if you're saying this, where should they be?
Yeah, so the simple answer is that the board needs to have a conversation about what their record keeping system will be, and then start to have their content stored in that system with a plan as to how to set up some kind of structure for that system, how to name files if they are electronic, and if they're not electronic, how to name paper files so that they're easy to find. As an example, if it was a paper file and you really made a decision you want to store paper minutes, maybe you are actually storing them in binders by year, but having a system that everybody agreed to, understood, and makes sense to them, that is the way that we're suggesting. I know that one of the things that Sandra will bring up at the end is a conversation about maybe standardizing some of this. and maybe a project which could get underway. So I don't want to jump too far into that conversation.
But I will say about minutes specifically, each board will have in its bylaws or in policy how it shares its goings on with its members, how it reports to members. Some boards will send out minutes along with a newsletter. Some boards will send out a précis of the meeting along with a newsletter. Some will provide you the minutes if you ask them for it, and that would be right in their bylaws. So different boards, different rules on how they communicate and report to their members. Because I think that might be what you were asking about. Okay, did we have another question? I thought there was somebody else. Was it Teresa? Nope, apparently not. Okay, Donna, do you want to keep
Okay.
going?
Yeah, let's keep going. So the next slide, please. Okay, so there's some great resources that are available that will help you with privacy. And there's in particular some samples for a privacy policy that's found in a particular document I've got on the screen there. And Sandra will be sending that out as part of the information package. But there's a really good amount of information in there about how to protect the personal information that's entrusted to you in that workbook for nonprofit organizations. Okay, so then the next part of this is whose role is it? And this was a great conversation that started with Sandra, where we started to talk about, well, whose job is it anyway? And I think everybody on every board feels, well, is this, whose position is this, right? So what we really think is important is to highlight for you that there needs to be a privacy contact in order to gain consent. And there's also the question, and I think, Alan, you brought it up, who's responsible for records management? And in terms of progress, how do you make some incremental improvements over time? And finally, one of the things that I really think is important that I want to share with you is I fully and truly believe that everyone on your board and even your volunteers have a role in record keeping. So when they generate records and they produce records, they all have a role in the record keeping function so that your board can successfully operate. So, the great questions we've had about minutes. Somebody might be the secretary, but that person needs support in order to have overall great records management for your board. So while there might be a privacy contact for getting consent, everybody in the organization needs to be doing their part to have a good record keeping system. Now, Alan, you brought that up earlier. Do you have someone accountable on your board, or is the group trying to work to a record keeping system? We lost you, Alan?
Afraid so, Donna.
Okay, too bad. Okay, we'll go on.
But it is a good point that this is everybody's issue, and Dave brought this up a little bit by having trouble getting people to agree to it. Just like everybody agreeing to name their documents the same thing, everybody has to have a role in privacy. So where there's often a privacy officer for the organization that would receive and deal with issues under PIPA, that person can be different event to event. So for example, for the EFCL AGM, we had a consent statement on our registration. If you might not have remembered if you registered, but it was there. It talked about why we were collecting the information and also that we were going to be recording the session and what we were going to do with it. However, we're really aware when we collect people's, pictures, names, and community league, which identify their neighborhood, right? that's a lot of information about somebody. So as the organizer of the AGM, I'm the contact for people with issues around that, because I could actually do something about it. So I guess that's the question. Who could actually help this person out in that situation?
Right, and Darlene, and I know someone else seconded it, with the turnover that we have with these volunteer roles, it's really crucial to set up your record keeping so that the future board, your successors, have the information they need to be successful. So when they don't know the history, they're all new people, could be on a board, it makes it very difficult to actually function as a group when they cannot locate prior agreements and get the understanding of the past decisions that were made because they lack the information to be successful. Then you're going to have continuity problems for your board and the way that you make decision, and you're introducing a high risk to your organization without that information that you can lay hands on and be actually accountable to make sure you can demonstrate what you've done in the past. Next slide. Case study. Okay, this is a great one. So we have a situation where we wanted to bring forward a case study for you. And I personally have faced this myself more than once. So it's around the criminal record checks that you might be collecting. So as a board, you gather criminal record checks, you print them, and then you store them in a paper file in the office. You wonder if this is a good practice. You know that others are storing in the Google Drive. Thoughts?
I guess my first thought is why we are keeping them. If we've just reviewed them and signed off on them as this qualifies you and it settles our mind about who you are, then it becomes well known that this person's been vetted, and we don't need to keep the record that made that happen. I think the record would be the discussion we had or the meeting we had where everyone agreed this person passes muster.
Great. Okay. Nice insight. Who wants to go next? Ray, did you want to say, come on, Mike, and say something?
We have members on our board that says a criminal check is only as accurate as the day that you get it. Because you can go out the next day and you can have your criminal check, but the next day you could commit a crime and all your records that you've obtained are null and void. So
right.
Why would you want to put the burden of people having to get a criminal check? We could understand it if it's to deal with children and stuff like that, but to have your whole board get a criminal check, that is a little unreasonable, I think.
Yeah, so this is a situation where, Ray, the board's already agreed that they have a policy to collect the criminal record check. It's just a screening process. But yeah, you're also raising an important, is this a good tool for screening? Was there another question too, Sandra, another person?
I'm not sure, but I did want to chime in with what Ray said, and it goes back to the first question we need to ask ourselves, which is, why are we collecting this?
Yes.
Right? Why is a criminal record check or a welfare check important? Well, if you're working with kids, if you're the treasurer,
yes,
right? That's important. Have you ever been convicted of fraud? That would be an important thing to know, right? But yeah, I have a problem with any kind of blanket policy, because that's when people don't do that thinking and questioning. They just say, oh, everybody needs to, just because it's easy. And that's where people really get into trouble, is when they do these automatic blanket kind of policies. And that's caused Darlene to raise her hand.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. But I'm a little off track from what you're saying, Sandra, in that I keep looking at that stored in the Google Drive, and I put in the chat add that when these records are sent via email. So once it's online or out in the web, it's there. And so, like, for example, for casinos, we're sending our forms with our birth date and everything, the board's birth dates, addresses, all of that's going via emails. And I don't know, I'm an old dog, so I'm a paper person, because then you can shred it. But yeah, so I don't have an answer. I just have that thought.
Well, I love that you're having the thought, Darlene, because, you know, we have so much concern about identity theft nowadays, and we're entrusted to protect personal information from the people we've collected it from. That is what we've done. And
Yeah.
so when you are entrusted as an organization to look after this information, and Ray, this is highly sensitive information, right? You kind of nailed that. It's highly sensitive. Do you have a criminal record or not? So what I'm really encountering, and there's privacy commissioners that have put this out, is it goes back to the earlier comment we had about just verifying. Verify that you have looked at the record, but there is no actual need to store it in the long term. So as it like the answer was perfect from the first answer, like just review it as a board. You have a policy, you want to do these checks. There's no need to keep a paper file in the office. You verify, you accept them on the board as having completed a criminal record check and passed it. That is a decision you're making. You're accepting them onto the board, and it should reflect that everybody's records was verified and that they were fully accepted because they met requirements. Now, I will say there is a bit of a caveat. If you actually did ever accept somebody that had a criminal record check, and you know, some people are overly cautious. So I have seen many HR departments keep an exception. So if there's someone accepted on the board with a criminal record check, the exception might be that that is kept as a record, that it was vetted and there was a conversation with the person to screen them. So that is the one exception I find. But this answer really requires you to be thoughtfully looking at the situation, like Sandra said, carefully assessing what the records are showing, and then not keeping them in unsecure locations in a paper file. But making sure that this confidential, highly personal information is being well managed in your organizations. And a Google Drive that everybody can access would not be a very secure location. And Darlene, you know, being old school is not such a terrible thing.
Thanks. I
So-
love my shredder.
Yeah,
Well, at
So,
least you're shredding.
a couple things there. The other thing with criminal record checks is only one other person needs to see them. It doesn't need to be passed around the board, right? The president, I've said, you know, make a checklist for each person. You know, did they submit this? Was it clean? Check. You know, do that, sign, you know, date it. When did you receive it? When did they get it? That's it. Give it back to them. And then maybe the vice president sees the presidents if there's a need. And then, like Donna said, if there's an exception, if somebody had a misdemeanor in their youth and they're going to be the secretary of your community league, and you decide, well, that doesn't matter one bit, and you've made an exception in this case, you may want to think about keeping it then in a very secure location, because you know you have made an exception. Otherwise, you know, don't keep it at all, and everybody doesn't need to see it. And as Ray said, think about why you're doing it. As to Darlene, I mean, it is dicey because we're entrusted with this information. We collect it from our board colleagues to send to AGLC for the casino. So we can only be responsible for our part in that, right? If AGLC, I mean, we do our due diligence. We read AGLC's policy and what they're going to do with this information and how they're using it and storing it. But if AGLC has a breach, that's on them. Is it, Donna? I hope.
Yeah, it is. And then they would actually be subject to FOIP and they would have to report. So, but you know, we're looking at your organization and trying to help you succeed in the work you're doing. Catherine, you have a question.
Not so much a question as a comment, and
Okay.
I think this is quite recent. I'm going to work at our casino tomorrow, and I haven't had to submit any information, so that may have changed at the gaming people. That they're not
Okay.
asking for all the birth dates and all that sort of stuff. So just so that you're perhaps current on that. I hope I'm not wrong. Our organizer checked that out and said we don't need to do that anymore.
Okay.
For key positions. For key positions, you do, Catherine, the birth date.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands raised.
Another thing they'll do is when you check in, they verify with your license and everything, so it's all linked one way or the other, but yeah, it's basically your key position, like mentioned earlier. So.
So we've got comments that it's key positions. Again, it's a good point. It's your board members and your volunteers. You are entrusted to look after their information. Let's go on to the next slide. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks for your insights there and your thoughts. Really makes it helpful. So you have a role in protecting and the information that's entrusted to you. Next slide. I'm going to just kind of skip over here this, but it is here in the package of information you're getting from tonight. In Canada, we had from 2014 legislation that put in place that you're not supposed to be spamming people with electronic messages. So if you're a community league and you're spamming people with messages constantly about your activity, it's really worthwhile to look at this anti-spam legislation and the things that you should be doing when you're actually sending out electronic messages to individuals who might be on your membership list. We're going to skip over it, but there's some there. We've got content here. And there's stuff that you can look at if you are doing that kind of activity. Next slide. Okay, this is another case study that we wanted to jump into. So you're having a draw for prizes. So you're selling memberships at an event and you later just decide that you would like to hold a draw for door prizes from some things that you've got from community businesses. The individuals who purchased a membership are eligible for the draw. Do you just make up draw slips for holding the draw? Thoughts? Anybody brave?
I'll start. I would ask my group or my events people or any of the volunteers to have that all figured out beforehand. That it's not a late decision. You can't sort of change boats. You're bound to get wet. So, you know, maybe it's just your ankles get wet, but some people drown. So if you want to threaten the organization by changing your plan, I would advise against it. And my group have heard me speak pretty strongly about, you know, figuring it out beforehand. And if you're not sure what you're going to do, take it right off the schedule. You're not going to try that unless you've got it all worked out. We had a thing about fireworks, and until they had it all figured out, they weren't going to get my permission.
Okay, great. So plan ahead. Chantel, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I would say that you have to have some kind of permission from those people that you're,
Right.
yeah, you have to have it planned ahead of time and get their permission, especially if you're going to announce the winner.
Yep. And you know, this is exactly right. You both are right on the mark, because what we're talking about is getting that consent, making sure that you're not doing one thing. It's almost like a bait and switch. And now this is a minor thing and it's a good news story, but you don't always know. Like Dave, you got a good point there. You don't always know how it'll be taken. You really don't. Now, let's say one of those businesses then says we want to have that list of everybody that put their name in the draw. Can you just pass that over? Okay, I get some head shaking, so people know exactly what to do now, which is great. Great, Chantel, thank you. No, the answer is no. You're not going to just turn over everybody that put the draw slips in, because they didn't consent for you to hand it over to a third-party vendor. They did not consent. So you're not going to just think, oh, well, this is great for their advertising. No, do not do that. It's not what they provided their membership information for. You're there to protect that information. Any questions or thoughts on that? Does everybody see how we came to that answer? Great. Next slide. Okay, sharing information. Okay, so with any kind of situation with vendors and any kind of marketing, we've touched on this just recent, like on this case study. If you have a collection of information, you want to make sure people are giving consent, that you are making sure that if you're providing information to somebody for vendors or marketing, that it's necessary to turn that information over. And it might be just some information, but not all information. So let's say you brought in a third-party vendor to do a training program. You know, you might be giving them a registration list of who should be in attendance, But you should not be turning over your entire membership list and saying, well, here's the list of our, no, it should be only what they need to have for the purpose of what they would be doing, which, let's say it's running a program for you. That's all that they need to have. Any questions on that? It should be fairly straightforward. Oh, Dave, you got your hand up again?
Yeah, it's actually not a question, but it's a thing I've started doing is actually asking the city why they need this information. And I get some really interesting answers.
Yeah, I think that most people need to be a lot more savvy, but we're all trusting. I guess that's part of how we've been. Okay, next slide, Sandra. Disposition of information. So this goes back to what Dave talked about. How long do we need to keep it? So a lot of the work I do is retention schedules for organizations, which are what to keep and for how long. So the best practice for having records in any organization is having some kind of records management policy and a schedule. And a schedule identifies the records that you should have, who's accountable for having them. But usually it's often by the role of the individual. And then we also put down a disposition of how long, how many years we'll keep it. And then is it destroyed or is it something permanent? So on this list, we have some examples. For many financial records that serve a purpose of having materials for audit purposes later, there's frequently a retention of 7 years. That's not black and white all the time, but usually financial management records are kept for 7 years. Many policy documents are kept for about 5 years. That's sort of a ballpark number to be followed. The approved minutes of a meeting that you might be having in terms of your governance records, those would frequently be permanent. And Sandra's going to speak to a little bit more about that. And things like the membership list. If you are actually getting your membership information from something like EFCL or the hockey or soccer or something, sometimes it might be a financial record for you, so that it would be 7 years. But if you're keeping that membership constantly up to date, it might be a record that you're actually just overwriting all the time. And therefore you just keep the current version of it and you're constantly overwriting it. So membership list is a little bit of a complicated record, and the way that you're actually using it and keeping it is also going to have a factor in how long you're keeping it. If you're updating it constantly, you're just going to keep the most current version constantly updated. Did I have a question there? Chantal, was that you?
No, it was a mistake.
Okay. Sandra, permanent records. This is a big deal, isn't it? You're the governance person.
Yes. Yes, minutes are permanent records, but only the approved ones. And this is what I'm seeing in a bunch of organizations get them into trouble because they keep multiple versions of minutes. Once your minutes, once you have an approved version, which means it's been approved at a board meeting, all of the drafts no longer exist. They should disappear. They do not count. I work with a corporate secretary in another role that she'll even make board members turn over their notes of board meetings, because the rule is that there is one version of events at a board meeting, and it's the approved minutes, right? We say that the board meetings are like making hot dogs. Everybody loves hot dogs. Nobody wants to see how they're made. And that's kind of like decisions at board meetings. So it's the minutes and nothing else. And I see a lot of places that have, draft 1, draft 2, draft to chair, draft all over the place. No, just the approved minutes, and you keep them forever and ever.
Right. So Chantal, yes, exactly. The board you're working with doesn't want everybody keeping drafts of financials. So you understand what they're trying to do is put in place processes so that they have good quality record keeping as an outcome of their work. And that's what Sandra's really promoting. And so, that's something that's really important. Now, Barb, you have a great question about what is an example of a policy document. So one example is the records management policy. I believe many boards should have sort of a blanket list of policies that they should have to help them govern. And things like their bylaws are an example of a policy, but also things like a records management policy, a privacy policy. Like if they are renting a hall, what's the hall rental policy? Those are all documents that guide the decision-making of the board so that they make effective decisions in their day-to-day operations as a board. Can you add anything more, Sandra, as the governance person?
Yeah, a policy is any rule that the board has made by motion that isn't the bylaws. So, you know, there's things that the board has to do in the Societies Act. There's things that the board has to do in their bylaws. Then there are things that the board has discretion over, right? All those discretionary type of things where the board debates, makes a rule, it should be written down and be a policy. And, you know, if it's not a full-fledged policy, then that's why you keep the minutes forever, right? Because it should be in the minutes.
So Barb, you brought up a great question. I have a degree in public administration, so I've worked with a lot of government organizations, and we try to keep policy for 5 years, because if you're formulating policy, you want to look back on the previous iterations. But if you are a group that's very comfortable with not having all that history, then you don't need it. You know, you can have a retention schedule that says we're only going to keep it for a short time. Why you keep some of it back, though, is as new people join, they want to be able to look back and say, well, how was it before? You know, you might get people that see a current policy and say, well, why did it change? Why did it change? What was the thinking behind that change? And that's why policy documents are often kept for 5 years, so that new people coming in can answer those questions by looking at the records without going back and phoning people up or guessing why it changed. You know, there might be a history to why it changed, and they want that history by having some records behind about those documents. Sandra, anything more to add?
No, I mean,
Anything-
it is helpful. I mean, some policies get stuck in people's minds, right? Well,
Yes, it
I
does.
thought it was this. And you can say, you know, yeah, it was that until, you know, 2018 when the board changed it because of this.
Right.
That's always helpful. But yeah, so I would keep, you know, 5 years is about good. I certainly wouldn't go any farther than that. There's only so much history anybody can use. The big part around the policy documents is to date them.
Right.
When
Perfect.
were they approved? Always have that on the policy documents, because the trick of keeping multiples is that then you pull the wrong one, and
Right.
and that's always a problem.
Yeah, and then you're searching for one you can't find at all.
Mhm.
Next slide. Strategy. So when you're faced with a records management project in your organizations, the first thing I usually recommend is getting an inventory, figuring out what you have, getting a sense of the scope of the problem you're facing. I see you nodding there, Dave, but what have you got? Where is it? What is it? Where is it stored? What do you have? That's the first step for any board, to know what the scope of the problem is. I also like to think about the end result. Like if you're also doing any kind of destruction, and with what we've talked tonight, I'd like to make sure it's secure. So if you're doing any kind of paper destruction, it should be shredded or burned, but in a way that makes sure that those records are not going to be visible to people later, and that personal information that might be in there released. With electronic records, there's things to do like double deleting, destroying an entire drive, making sure that the media is securely destroyed. There's also hidden records to watch out for, which people often don't think about. If you're leasing a photocopier, often there's actually records on that copier. So it's important to make sure that that is not information being released outside of your organization without being managed. And then the other part that we talked about, Sandra and I, as we prepared this presentation, is that when you're offboarding board members and volunteers that have been working and serving your organization, do you actually gather up records from them that might be in their home, on a laptop, on a memory stick, you know, things that you have that it may be in their house, that you need to gather back? And that is a high risk activity that happens, that people are out of the good nature of their heart, you know, doing volunteer roles, but they don't necessarily turn over those important records for the operation, because they think the records belong to them personally, but they actually belong to the organization, which is your community league. And that personal information belongs to the individual who it's about. So they need to think differently about the fact that they're entrusted in a role that's fundamental to making sure that we're doing a good job of governance in our organizations. Next slide.
I just wanted to really hit that point again before we go on, is that when board members leave, they either need to be sending some of their stuff back that needs to be kept and deleting what doesn't need to be kept. So that's really the strength of records retention policy, is giving that guideline to people when you're leaving the board. You know, here's what we need back. Here's what you can delete. Because when I was thinking about it, you know, I started talking to Donna about, well, they could delete their emails. She's like, well, no, not all the time, because those emails could contain personal information or a decision, that kind of stuff. And I suspect that a lot of community league boards are not doing this when people leave.
Yeah.
And now some of that is helped when you have emails for people, when it's president at Argyle Community League or secretary at Ellerslie, right? That it's not Christine in her private email.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
those emails really help, but still, you know, stuff is going to get to your home email. It just is. And when you leave a board, it's your responsibility to go through that stuff and make sure it's disposed of properly, or it's given back to the organization. And that's caused some hands, Dave, and then Ray.
Those are great points, because I've had to browbeat my group to use the Argyle Mail, and they profess not to want to add another account, etc. And I've told them, well, you're not really participating. You're not actually doing board work unless you're using that email. And so they had to make that distinction, that if I'm going to send Dave some information on personal, I'm going to send it back to him and say, you have to put this in here because it's not yours. But then I'm a guy who's, you know, I've done military record keeping, and you want to know detailed, they're the guys. And the resistance I get, I guess, is just silliness, because I'm a volunteer. I don't have to follow all these silly rules. I'm just volunteering. And yes, you are, but you're also doing a lot of work that's legal or work that represents the organization. And therefore, your personal email address doesn't count. And I just had an episode last year where a head of a committee was sending emails to the city with his own personal email, and he was using his personal home address as the place to reach him. And I had to train this guy to realize that they think you're defrauding the city. That's what they'll think you're doing. If you don't have a record of being representing Argyle, you can't be representing Argyle. So they couldn't trust that until I got him to straighten it out. And then he realized, oh yeah, right, they'll just think I'm a nut. And so he started using the right email.
Yeah,
but
great.
It almost goes back to my first part
Great
with you and
comments.
Donna, saying you have to show them why this is important. And I've only managed to convince 1 out of the 7. So, all right.
Well, and you know, the point is, I know that there's some follow-up Sandra would like to do, but it's, you know, I think that there's a lack of awareness, a real lack of awareness of why you're representing the organization in a role, and the information does not personally belong to you. Ray, do you have something more?
I was just gonna say, so what do you do when board members leave your board and you request to have this stuff returned to you and they don't do it? So if they're a member in bad standing, I mean, and they've got these records out there, what can you do other than, you know, the copy that you're filing is the final copy? But
Yeah,
if they got information that's really sensitive out there, your hands are tied. I mean, I don't know how you're gonna force them to give
you know,
this
you say
thing.
that, Ray, but I personally have been in situations where someone's gone to the house of the membership director. And I don't like to say that it was easy. It wasn't easy, but someone had to go to someone's house. I will tell you that. And it was, you know, that person was entrusted with membership cards and they went to their home. So I hear you, but it's not a problem to just ignore. And I
Yeah.
guess, you know, Sandra, sadly, I put it almost at call for getting input from someone at EFCL. Like, I'm in this difficult situation. How should it be handled? You know, maybe consulting a lawyer. I'm sorry, but it might have to come to that, like a carefully worded letter saying
Mhm.
that is property of the fill in the blank community league and we need it back. And we are entrusted to protect the citizens in our area. And this is information that belongs to the league, not to you personally.
The other question I had is for Sandra, I think. So what do you do when, like, in instance for our community league, we have our designation president at ecl.com or whatever, but in behind the scenes, it comes to my personal email. So, I mean, even though it's going for the president, when it comes to my email, it's actually going to my
Yeah.
personal email.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have it forwarded to your email.
That's
So if you leave, you know, you want to make sure that all the emails and your responses show up in that president's email box, right? Because what that's doing is leaving the next person who follows you with the record. So they know when somebody out of the blue says, well, I had this deal that, you know, I did this. They can actually look and see that's there. And then you just delete them all, double delete them out of your email box.
Yeah.
Right. And leave them in the president's one. As to yeah, we could certainly help you with a letter there. Also, it can be for some people. It's just technological know-how. I had that with the treasurer who was an elderly person, and she had no idea what a zip drive was and how, I mean, to her, these things were on her computer. The fact that she could get them off the computer, just it didn't compute for her. So I did go to her house, but not in a I'm going to your house kind of way. I just went there. We had a cup of tea. I put everything on the zip drive. I deleted it for her. You know, sometimes it's just the abilities with technology. I think George has a question.
Hi, thank you. I'm with the Edmonton Sport Council, and I send out a weekly newsletter. And the community leagues are one of the mailing lists that I send to.
Okay.
And I think that a lot of people who are in volunteer positions of president or vice president or sports director don't understand that when they unsubscribe, then they've permanently unsubscribed that email address from receiving my newsletter. So every subsequent volunteer will never receive it again. And I can't resubscribe you with the mailing list I have. I find it really frustrating that I think it's a lack of understanding. I don't think there's
Yes.
anything malicious here, that they've shut their organization out of future sources of information.
Yeah, great comment, George. Thank you for that. And that's a good point. Like the transition, George, the issue is the transition we're having between board members and sport. You know, the sharing of information is becoming an issue. So, and Darlene, your comment, I've done entire workshops on email management. Email management is a significant issue for most organizations. Emails are our way that we send memos and communicate nowadays. They contain quite a lot of information. We use them for sending attachments. So, and we have some coming up messaging that Sandra's just put in the chat. So let's go on to the next slide, Sandra. Great. Thank you, everybody. Like this night goes by faster with more engagement when all of you contribute like this. So membership cards in storage. This is actually real. And people are often storing their membership cards in storage, those ones we get from the FCL, the nicely printed one. So you notice in your storage area that there are boxes with several years worth of membership cards. You wonder if this is a good idea. Who'd like to put their input into this one?
I'm not qualified to comment because we don't issue membership cards, so.
Okay. Chantel, how about you?
Yes, I sent many boxes of membership cards to the shredder.
Okay, you've got them in the shredder. Okay, great. Ray, what about you?
I would say you have a record, how long you're gonna store those records, and then how you're gonna destroy them, so.
Okay, so the challenge of this question is, how is your membership list being maintained? So if you, let me give you an example. If you're using Excel to actually track your membership and you have your membership director fully electronic and they take the card and they put all the data into Excel, they really don't need anything on that membership card. They've already got all the data of that card in their Excel spreadsheet. So in that case, they really can purge the paper copy as a transitory record and not keep it in a storage locker.
But what happens if that file gets corrupted and you lose all that data?
Okay, well, that's backing up. At that point, great, good comment. Backing it up. I know that there's a Google workshop that Sandra's talking about coming, but yeah, never having this, you're exactly right. Never having this one particular file, having secure, reliable software that you're doing that record keeping with. So yeah, great comment. Jill, do you have a comment too?
So basically what we do with our membership cards is, like you said, we do keep it in an Excel sheet for the last 5 years. And then with the cards themselves, what we actually do is we photocopy them so that we also have a copy to follow on. So if someone says, I didn't authorize you to send me, a newsletter, blah, blah, blah. We do actually have a photocopy to look at and show the person and say, yeah, no, we can see here that you did place one, we're sorry, we will remove you kind of thing off of the list. And then again, with the digital copy, we do destroy the hard copies. And then with Excel that we have like on Google Drive, we do have that password protected as well too, so that not everyone has direct access to the file, just the president, the vice president, and the membership, because you want that redundancy, because like you said, if all of a sudden my membership director leaves, she has the key to the whole list, at least then, I have a fallback person that can go back and open it up and take a look and say yes.
Okay, so for those people that were struggling to hear, Jill was saying that they often keep photocopies of the hard copy records to showcase as a backup if someone comes back and say, hey, I haven't been receiving the newsletter, etc. So in his situation, he's keeping a backup copy for the purpose of, in case there's questions from a member about whether they're receiving the membership newsletter or not. So yeah, that's a fail-safe way that he's developed for his organization. But generally, one of my biggest concerns is storage areas are often like a rental unit, like Centennial Storage or somebody's home. And I would love to see that these things are properly looked after for the content on them, that you have personal information collected on those cards, and to make sure that they are being very securely stored and that you have a need to have them as hard copy. Is someone like, why would a hard copy storage lock, why would you have hard copy in a storage locker that no one's looking at? You need to make sure that you have a purpose for having that record into storage. Any other comments? Sandra, we are sharing the recording to everybody. That's a question that's just come in on the chat. So, okay, we're going to go on to the next slide. So I hope we've shared some great ideas tonight that you can take away some idea. Next slide. And have some kind of discussion with your board, maybe from something you heard tonight. Is there one thing that you're going to do right away? Dave?
I'm going to rush out and buy a bullwhip. That's what I'm going to do. Just hold it in my hand as I explain these things to people.
Okay, so
And
there's
tell
two
them the
ways to motivate
consequences.
people. Carrot
Yes,
and the stick.
it's one of the ways to motivate.
Sorry, what did you say you're gonna go buy?
A bullwhip.
Or a bullwhip.
Okay, well, that's one action way to solve a problem, but maybe there's others. Catherine?
Well, mine actually comes, so what am I gonna do? I've got some paper, like when I inherited the box of the old cards, and not too long ago I took some for shredding. I thought I'll count them because I don't even know if there's sort of a record of how many members we had that year. My membership is fairly small, so it's actually more manageable for me in a hard copy in many ways.
Okay.
But as I've listened to this tonight, I feel like the records, I mean, sorry to be saying this, but at our league and what's going on there, and we've been barely having enough board members and changing and stuff. Like, I hope this workshop is going to be run again and again. I just think this is so important. So thank you for bringing it.
Right. So Catherine, if your head is spinning, do the inventory. Make a list.
It is, but like, I need other people on our board to hear this because it's
Yes.
not my role and my thing. I can bring it forward, but it's like, yeah, this has been really, really insightful and very interesting.
Thank you for that feedback, Catherine. I really believe in this. I'm passionate about records management and I've done this for a lot of years. So thank you for that really important feedback. Anybody else? One thing, simple, quick one is to share the ideas with the board. Ray, do you have
I was
something?
just wondering if we have the recording from the session tonight, can we share it with our boards? Or is that another FOIP issue with all?
No, not a FOIP issue. I have no issues with that. And the other thing is I've done some material that I've recorded for the Association of School Board Officials on how to create a records management program, and that's on a public website. Sandra, I think I've shared that with you before. So if you want to listen to a recording of how to set up a records management program, that exists publicly on the Association of School Board Officials website, that you can actually listen to a training recording for free from work that they've done.
Okay, so we'll include that in the follow-up email, that recording as well.
Yeah, that would be
Absolutely.
great. So again, going back, if you're feeling overwhelmed from this, Sandra's got some great news coming up, but I also think just start with a list. What is your biggest issue? Maybe tackle one thing that you could do. So for the fall, what's one thing that we could do to improve? And one project, I like Catherine's, like start the membership. That's high risk personal information. What's being done for membership? That's not a bad area to start. Next slide.
Is next steps, which is me. So we have resources for you, including the workbook for the nonprofit organizations. This is an awesome resource, as well as some stuff about privacy laws and privacy management. So that and the recording we talked about, and this one will be sent to you with the slides in the follow-up email. Look for that in the next couple of days. We also have some opportunities for you. One, we have for the people who are using Google, we have a couple of sessions coming up on moving your leagues online, which is a Google trainer. We have got to come and talk specifically this kind of content, but specifically for Google, right? How do you do what we're talking about here specifically on Google Drives? And that first one is June 14th at noon. It's a lunch and learn kind of thing, an hour. And registration, I will send that to you in the email, but it's also, of course, on our website, right? A handy dandy calendar of events. The other thing we're thinking of is, since we gave you kind of the start in this, is to see if there are a few community leagues who would like to dive deeper into this and to create a privacy policy working group. I didn't say that out loud when I typed it. If there are community leagues represented here, or if you go back to your league and are talking about it, and you've got a league that's interested in creating a privacy policy for your league, which would include that handy dandy retention schedule. So all those policy pieces, right? How do we keep information? How do we store it? How long are we going to keep each piece? That kind of stuff. We'd like to get a few of you together to sit down with me and to write that policy. I'll help you. And then we can share it around as a model with other community leagues. So I thought, you know, if some community leagues are going to go back and write policy, why are we all doing this? Why not do it together and do it once, and then have something we can share? So, you know, I don't see the point in, you know, 4 or 5 people taking this session and then all going back in isolation and struggling to write a policy. Let's get together on it. So if you'd like to do that and you get my follow-up email, if you just reply to me, that would be great, and we can set something up. So
Great. Well,
that's,
Thanks, Sandra. Like that is a great opportunity. And so I know that there's immediate plans and activities underway that could further this topic for you that's being put together by ESL. So those are great opportunities. So we've got our contact information here. Sandra is the governance person who's got a lot that she's spearheading and with change over at the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues. And I am there with my Hotmail account and my phone number, living here in Edmonton, and happy to provide records management help if you ever need some. I know that as a board member for the Horizon Community League, we really struggle. So don't make me, you know, I get where you're all coming from. It's not easy because you have to get everybody on board. It's not something you can do by yourself, but it's something that I think is very worthwhile to the success of your organization. And I think that my own experience of this has been challenging, but I also think that it's been opportunities where we can do better. So Sandra, back over to you. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? I guess we have time if people want to talk to us about a particular issue.
I can stop sharing my screen and see you all. Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add, and it is 8:01, so we're bang on our time, Donna. But if anybody does want to stick around and ask us specific questions, we can sure do that. Or if you don't have any further questions, we've probably filled your brain up pretty full with all of this, and maybe even scared you a bit about all of that random information you have hanging around. So enjoy the rest of the evening.